Welcome back to our continuing treatment of the Gospel according to the Apostle Matthew, the first book of the New Testament, not first in time, but first in placement. Matthew chapter 23, verses 25 and 26. I will be reading out of this Bible, which is actually just a New King James Version Bible. Verse 25 of Matthew chapter 23. Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, for you cleanse the outside of the cup and dish, but inside you are full of extortion and self-indulgence. Blind Pharisees, first clean the inside of the cup and dish, and the outside of them will be clean also. If you are to understand the problem that Jesus had with the Pharisees and those who followed their vision of faith, we need to understand what they're doing. We need to understand their rationale. Now, remember, what we call the Old Testament was even old in the time of Jesus. What we are saying is that there's parts of the Old Testament, and think here of the law of Moses, those in particular teachings that are found in the first 5 books of Moses. The actual laws of Moses, of course, are not so much in Genesis. And what we're saying is that material was something like 1,200 years old by the time of Jesus came to be. The Israel of that era lived in a different era than the Israel of the Roman era. Very different era. The way the world operated was different. The focus of the people was different. And so you had a case in which you had these ancient texts. And so what the Pharisees were doing were 2 things at once. One was they were showing reverence and respect for the older works. They weren't just saying, you know what, these are old, let's ditch them. But they were also working with and trying to, secondly, make them relevant to today. That is their today, not my today. And so what emerges in the Pharisaic movement is a reverence for what is called the oral tradition. So you have the written text, and the oral tradition was the attempt to take those teachings and make them applicable to the present. And that's what the oral tradition originally was. So when we look at Jesus's problem with the Pharisees, understand that the debate and division and dissension was not over the actual sacred text, not over the first 5 books of Moses. Where Jesus ran into problems with the Pharisees and the teachers of the law, the scribes, is in what could be called the oral tradition. This oral tradition would later be codified and become an essential part of the Judaic movement and of Judaism, we could say. And the oral tradition was where Jesus had his problems with them. And if you look at this passage that is in front of us, you can see an example of this. In the sacrificial system as found in the books of Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy, you have the importance of washing. There is a sense in which part of the temple procedures, and of course, back then it was actually the tabernacle first. The temple was still a couple hundred years away. In the tabernacle, there were center place given to washings. So, for example, if you go to Exodus chapter 30 and verse 17 to 21, just one example here, is that there was a large basin which was used for washings. It is from this that the oral tradition developed, and in particular, their particular ideas about cleansing their dishes. Now, understand, what they're trying to do is take an ancient text, make it relevant for today. But the problem is within their oral tradition, they eventually incorporated into it some very twisted understandings and ideas of the faith. And the problem was they ended up reading that back into the original text, and therefore were no longer really reading the original text, but serving their oral tradition. What Jesus is upset about is how an interpretation has come to take precedence over the truth of the text. What was the underlying truth of that text? The problem was that the original text was not about cleaning crockery or pottery. Jesus is pointing us to the inner truth of what the washings were about. The sacrificial system was concerned about purity, and in that sense, not what was clean. Purity is about the inner state. What the Pharisaic movement failed to see is that external cleaning is not a substitute for inner purity. Now, Jesus is not saying all Pharisees failed at this point. He was saying that their system cannot provide the means to bring about purity. In other words, your fixation on making sure your bowl for your Rice Krispies is clean is not going to guarantee that you yourself are pure and holy in the sight of God. He was saying that their system could not provide the means to bring about purity. You see, a rule-based, law-driven religious system will always create an external religion. We have made this point before about legalism. Legalism always lends to this. And what happens is the precedence becomes the rules, and the keeping of the rules and the externals, and not the inner person. The faith of both testaments was to be an internal one, an inner one. It's something inward, a faith that from the inside to the outside created people who are pure and holy. Legalism always leads to destructive church practices. One of the things that the early church did was embrace the idea that the Gentiles could come to faith without converting to Judaism first. This might seem obvious to us, but it was not obvious to the first generation of the church. One of the problems was that Jewish sensibilities of clean versus unclean meant the Jews in this era were reticent to be in the presence of the Gentiles. You see, these people were unclean, and you see that these people were unclean people who could make you unclean. That was the thought. So to gather with these unclean people was to make yourself unclean. Well, how can you have a church of Jew and Gentile if you have this great division between the two? You cannot. And so the early church had to come to see that through faith in Jesus Christ, all are made right, all are made clean, all are made holy and right in the sight of God. It is not the externals that do it, but it's the inner and the relationship with God, which was made possible through, in the New Testament era, the death and resurrection of Jesus Christ. The purity that comes through a faith experience cannot be compromised by an association with sinners. And that's what Jesus practiced, He went with all sorts of undesirable people because he knew that the purity and holiness within could not be compromised by his association with those outside the kingdom of God.